Miranda Foster stared at her reflection in the mirror of the employee bathroom at Richardson Memorial Hospital. Her hands trembled as she smoothed down her white nurse's uniform. Today wasn't just another day at work. It was the day she would meet him again. James Richardson, the man who had broken her heart 15 years ago and who now owned this very hospital. She had worked so hard to build a new life after he left her for that rich socialite Victoria Ashcroft. Miranda had put herself through nursing school, raised their daughter Sarah alone, and never told him about the child he had left behind. But now, as the new owner of Richardson Memorial, James would be touring every department, including the pediatric ward where she worked. The staff meeting was buzzing with excitement when Miranda arrived. Everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of the handsome billionaire who had inherited the hospital from his late father. As she took her seat, Betty, her closest friend at work, squeezed her hand. "You okay, honey?" Betty whispered. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Miranda forced a smile. "I'm fine. It's just another day." But it wasn't just another day. The moment James walked into the conference room, time seemed to stand still. He looked older, more distinguished, with touches of grey at his temples, but his eyes were the same deep blue. She remembered. Those eyes that had once looked at her with so much love. James was in the middle of his speech about modernizing the hospital when his gaze fell on Miranda. He faltered for just a second, but she saw it. The flash of recognition, the slight widening of his eyes. He recovered quickly, continuing his presentation, but his eyes kept drifting back to her. After the meeting, Miranda rushed back to her patients, hoping to avoid any confrontation. She was checking on little Tommy, a 7-year-old recovering from appendix surgery, when she heard that familiar voice behind her. Miranda Foster." She turned slowly, her heart pounding. "Hello, James." "I can't believe it's really you," he said, taking a step closer. "All these years, why didn't you tell me you worked here?" "Why would I?" Miranda replied, keeping her voice steady. "We haven't spoken since the day you told me you were marrying Victoria." A shadow crossed his face. "Miranda, about that day—" "Mr. Richardson," a voice interrupted. It was Dr. Peterson, the chief of pediatrics. "We need to discuss the new equipment." "Budget?" James hesitated. "We'll talk later," he said to Miranda, before following Dr. Peterson. That evening, as Miranda was gathering her things to leave, she found a note on her locker. "Please meet me in my office. We need to talk. J." She knew she should ignore it, but 15 years of unspoken words weighed heavily on her heart. Making her way to the executive floor, Miranda found James standing by the window of his luxurious office looking out at the city lights. "Your wife won't like you meeting with me," Miranda said, staying near the door. James turned, and there was pain in his eyes. "Victoria and I divorced 3 years ago. She left me for a younger man." "I'm sorry to hear that," Miranda said, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. "I made a terrible mistake, Miranda," James said, moving closer. "My father threatened to disinherit me if I didn't marry Victoria. He said he'd make sure I never worked in this city again. I was young and ambitious, and you chose money over love," Miranda finished for him. "Yes," he admitted. "It's been my biggest regret. Not a day goes by that I don't think about you, about what we had." Miranda's heart raced. This was the moment she had imagined countless times over the years. But now, standing here, she thought of Sarah, their beautiful, talented daughter, who was now in her first year of medical school. Sarah, who had never known her father, who had grown up wondering why she didn't have a dad like other kids. "It's too late, James," she said softly. "Too much time has passed. Too many things have happened." "What things?" he asked, reaching for her hand. "Miranda, please, give me a chance to make things right." Just then, Miranda's phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "Mom, guess what? I just aced my anatomy final. Call me when you get home. Love you." Miranda looked at the message, then at James, who was still holding her hand. The truth sat heavy on her tongue. Should she tell him about Sarah? Did he deserve to know he had a daughter? And what would this revelation do to Sarah's life, to the careful world Miranda had built for them? "I have to go," she said, pulling her hand away. But as she reached the door, she turned back. "James, there's something you need to know, something that might change everything." The look in his eyes told her he knew this wasn't just about their past romance. Something in her voice, in her hesitation, had alerted him that whatever she was about to say would shake the very foundation of his world. But before Miranda could continue, the door burst open. Victoria Ashcroft herself stormed in, looking as elegant and cold as ever in her designer suit. "James, darling," she purred, then stopped short at the sight of Miranda. Well, look who it is. The little nurse who couldn't keep you. How quaint." Miranda straightened her spine. "Good evening, Victoria. I was just leaving." "Oh, don't leave on my account," Victoria said with a predatory smile. "I'm sure James would love to hear all about your little secret." Miranda froze. How could Victoria know? Had she known all along about Sarah? James looked between the two women, confusion etched on his face. What secret? What's going on? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Miranda's carefully constructed world was about to change forever, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what would come next. Victoria's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Miranda's hands grew cold as she watched James's face, trying to read his reaction. The elegant office suddenly felt too small, too confined. "What exactly are you talking about, Victoria?" James demanded, his voice sharp with irritation. "What? Secret?" Victoria walked to his desk, trailing her manicured fingers across its polished surface. "Oh, James, you always were a bit slow on the uptake. Haven't you ever wondered why dear Miranda here disappeared so completely after you married me? Why she never tried to contact you?" Miranda's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "This isn't your story to tell, Victoria." "Oh, but it is," Victoria smiled, cruel and beautiful like a snake. "You see, James, while you were building your empire with me, your precious Miranda was raising your child." The words fell like bombs in the quiet office. James staggered back, gripping the edge of his desk. His face went pale as he turned to Miranda. "Is this true?" he whispered. Miranda couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears filling her eyes. "A daughter," Victoria continued, clearly enjoying the drama. "Quite pretty from what I hear. Going to medical school now, isn't she, Miranda?" James sank into his chair, running his hands through his silver-streaked hair. "A daughter. I have a daughter. All these years—" "James, please," Miranda found her voice. "I wanted to tell you. Today, just now, I was about to— 15 years. James exploded, standing up so suddenly his chair crashed against the wall. 15 years, Miranda, how could you keep this from me? She's my child too." "Your child?" Miranda's voice rose with years of suppressed anger. "Where were you when she had chickenpox and cried all night? Where were you when she broke her arm falling off her bike? Where were you at her high school graduation when she was valedictorian?" "You never gave me the chance," James shouted back. "You never told me. You were married to me," Victoria cut in smoothly. "Living the high life, making millions. Don't pretend you would have chosen differently if you'd known." James whirled on Victoria. "You knew. All this time you knew I had a daughter?" Victoria's perfect composure cracked slightly. "Of course I knew. My private investigator told me. The moment Miranda turned up pregnant, I thought it might come in handy someday." "Get out!" James's voice was deadly quiet. "Darling, don't be dramatic. Get out!" he roared. Victoria gathered her designer purse, straightening her spine. "Fine, but remember, James, you chose this life. You chose me. Everything else is just collateral damage." She clicked her way to the door on her expensive heels, pausing for one last barb. "By the way, Miranda, your daughter looks just like her father. Same blue eyes." After she left, the silence in the office was deafening. Miranda sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. James paced the room like a caged animal. "Tell me about her," he finally said. "Please." Miranda pulled out her phone, hands shaking as she opened her photos. "Her name is Sarah Foster. She's 15 years old, studying pre-med at Columbia. She's brilliant, James, top of her class." James took the phone, staring at the picture of a beautiful young woman with his eyes and Miranda's smile. "Sarah," he whispered, testing the name. "My daughter's name is Sarah." "She doesn't know about you," Miranda said quietly. "I told her. Her father died before she was born. I thought it would be easier than explaining the truth. James looked up sharply. Easier? For whom, Miranda? For you? For her? Or for your own bitter heart? Don't you dare judge me, Miranda snapped. You have no idea what it was like, being left for another woman, finding out I was pregnant, having to start my life over completely alone. I did what I thought was best for my daughter. Our daughter, James corrected. And now what? What happens now? Before Miranda could answer, her phone buzzed again. Another text from Sarah. Mom, can you pick up some groceries on your way home? I'm staying over tonight, remember? Love you. James saw the message. She's at your house? Right now? Miranda stood up, gathering her things. Yes, and I need to go. This is too much for one night. Miranda, wait. James caught her arm. We need to figure this out. She's my daughter. I have a right to know her. A right? Miranda pulled away. You lost that right when you chose your father's money over our love. Sarah is happy. She's successful. She doesn't need her world turned upside down because you suddenly feel guilty. That's not fair and you know it, James said. If I had known. But you didn't know. Miranda cut him off. And now, 15 years later, what do you expect? That you can just walk into her life and everything will be perfect? That she'll welcome you with open arms? I don't know what to expect. James ran his hands through his hair in frustration. But I know I can't just pretend I don't know about her now. I won't. Miranda reached the door, then turned back. I'll tell her. But I'll do it my way, in my own time. She's my daughter, James. She's been mine alone for 15 years. You don't get to come in and take control just because you found out about her. How long, James asked. How long will you make me wait? Miranda looked at him, really looked at him. The man she had once loved so desperately, the father of her child, now a stranger who could destroy the careful life she had built. Give me 1 week, she said finally. 1 week to figure out how to tell her that her whole life has been built on a lie. As Miranda drove home that night, her mind was racing. How would Sarah react? Would she hate Miranda for lying? Would she want to know James? And what about James himself? Could she trust him not to hurt Sarah the way he had hurt her? The lights were on in her small but cozy house when she pulled into the driveway. Through the window, she could see Sarah in the kitchen, probably making one of her famous study night sandwiches. Her daughter looked so happy, so secure in her world. Miranda sat in her car for a long moment, gathering her courage. In 1 week, everything would change. But for tonight, she just wanted to hold her daughter close and pretend that the past hadn't come back to haunt them all. Little did she know, Victoria Ashcroft was already setting wheels in motion that would change their lives forever. In her luxurious penthouse across town, she was making a phone call that would shake the very foundation of the Richardson empire and threaten to destroy not just James's newfound daughter, but everything he had ever built. The next morning, Miranda barely slept. She watched Sarah eat breakfast, chattering excitedly about her upcoming exams, and felt her heart breaking. Every smile, every gesture that reminded her of James seemed to stab at her conscience. "Mom, are you okay?" Sarah asked, noticing her mother's distraction. "You seem weird today," Miranda forced a smile. "Just tired, sweetie. Long shift yesterday." But across town, in the penthouse suite of the city's most exclusive building, Victoria was already putting her plan into motion. She sat at her marble desk, speaking into her phone. "Yes, Mr. Chen," she purred. "I have some very interesting information about James Richardson's personal situation. Information that your investment firm might find relevant before finalizing that $100 million deal with Richardson Memorial." She paused, listening to the response. "Oh no, this isn't blackmail, Mr. Chen. Consider it due diligence. After all, shouldn't you know if the man you're trusting with your money has been hiding a secret love child all these years?" At the hospital, James couldn't focus on his meetings. He kept looking at Sarah's picture on his phone, seeing himself in her features. The way she smiled, the shape of her eyes. How had he not known? How had he walked past her mother every day in this hospital and not felt the connection? "Mr. Richardson?" His secretary's voice interrupted his thoughts. "The board members are waiting in the conference room." James straightened his tie and walked into the meeting, but his mind was elsewhere. He barely heard the discussion about budget allocations and new equipment. Instead, he was thinking about 15 years of lost birthdays, school plays, and father-daughter moments he would never get back. Meanwhile, Miranda was dealing with her own crisis. Betty cornered her in the break room, her eyes wide with concern. "Girl, what happened in that office yesterday? The whole hospital is buzzing about how Victoria Ashcroft showed up, and there was some kind of showdown." Miranda's hands shook as she poured her coffee. "Betty, I need you to keep a secret. A big one. Honey, you know I'm like a vault. What's going on?" Miranda took a deep breath. "Sarah, she's James Richardson's daughter." Betty's coffee cup crashed to the floor. "What? Our James Richardson, the owner of this hospital, that James Richardson?" "The same one. And now he knows," Victoria told him. "Oh, Lord." Betty sank into a chair. No wonder he looked like he'd seen a ghost during that staff meeting. "But Miranda, why didn't you ever tell him? He was married to Victoria. He chose her, chose his father's money over me. What was I supposed to do?" Betty reached across the table and squeezed her friend's hand. "What are you going to tell Sarah?" "I have a week," Miranda whispered. "I promised James I'd tell her in a week." "But Betty, how do you tell your child that her whole life has been built on a lie?" Before Betty could answer, their pagers went off simultaneously. Emergency in pediatrics. Both nurses rushed to respond, their personal drama temporarily forgotten in the face of professional duty. But as they hurried down the corridor, they passed James coming out of his office. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and the weight of their shared secret felt like a physical presence between them. That afternoon, Sarah stopped by the hospital to have lunch with her mother, as she often did between classes. Miranda's heart nearly stopped when she saw her daughter walking down the same hallway where James was talking to some doctors. "Sarah, wait," Miranda called out, but it was too late. James turned at the sound of her voice and found himself face to face with his daughter for the first time. Sarah smiled politely and stepped around him, not knowing she had just brushed past her own father. James stood frozen, watching her walk away. She was even more beautiful in person than in photos. The way she carried herself, confident and graceful, made his chest ache with pride and regret. "Was that her?" he whispered when Miranda reached him. Miranda nodded, unable to speak. "She looks so much like my mother," James said softly. "She has her walk, her grace." "Mr. Richardson?" a nurse interrupted. "Your sister Helen is on line 1. She says it's urgent." James reluctantly turned away, but not before giving Miranda a look that said their conversation wasn't over. In his office, James picked up the phone. "Helen, what's wrong?" His sister's voice was tight with worry. "James, what's this? I'm hearing about you having a secret daughter. Victoria just called me." James gripped the phone harder. "Helen, I can explain." "James, the board is already talking. Chen Industries is threatening to pull out of the deal. This could ruin everything we've built." "I don't care about the deal," James exploded. "I just found out I have a daughter, a brilliant, beautiful daughter who doesn't even know I exist. How can you be worried about business at a time like this?" Helen's voice softened. "James, of course I care about my niece, but Victoria is out for blood. She's telling everyone you knowingly abandoned your child, that you paid Miranda to keep quiet. The shareholders are panicking." James felt the blood drain from his face. Victoria wasn't just trying to hurt him, she was trying to destroy him, and she didn't care if she hurt Sarah in the process. Back in the hospital cafeteria, Sarah was sharing her excitement about medical school with her mother. "And Dr. Peterson says I might be able to do my residency here after I graduate. Wouldn't that be amazing, Mom? Working in the same hospital as you?" Miranda tried to smile, but her eyes filled with tears. "Mom?" Sarah's face creased with concern. "What's wrong? You've been crying a lot lately. Is everything okay?" Miranda reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Sarah? Honey? There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." But before she could continue, her pager went off again. Another emergency. "Go," Sarah said, understanding. "We'll talk tonight?" Miranda hugged her daughter. Tight, probably too tight. "Yes, tonight, I promise." As she rushed off to handle the emergency, Miranda didn't see Victoria watching from the cafeteria entrance, a satisfied smile on her perfectly painted lips. Phase 1 of her plan was complete. Sow the seeds of doubt and watch James's carefully constructed world begin to crumble. That evening, as Sarah waited at home for her mother to return and explain what was bothering her, Victoria was meeting with the hospital board members at an exclusive restaurant across town. The whispers she was spreading would soon become shouts, and the comfortable life Miranda had built for her daughter was about to be turned upside down. And James? He sat alone in his office, staring at old photos on his phone. Photos of him and Miranda from 15 years ago, when love seemed simple and choices seemed clear. How could he have known that one decision would create ripples that would affect so many lives? And more importantly, how could he fix it before Victoria's vindictive plan destroyed not just his reputation, but his newfound daughter's life as well? That night, Miranda never made it home to have that important talk with Sarah. A massive pile-up on the highway brought dozens of emergency cases to Richardson Memorial, and she had to stay for a double shift. As she helped treat the injured, she kept checking her phone, her heart heavy with guilt at having to postpone the conversation yet again. Sarah understood, of course. She always did. "Don't worry, Mom," she texted. "I'll see you tomorrow. Love you." But tomorrow would bring its own complications. Victoria's carefully planted rumors were already spreading through the hospital like wildfire. Nurses whispered in corners, doctors exchanged meaningful looks, and everyone seemed to be watching both Miranda and James with new interest. Betty tried to shield her friend from the worst of it. "Just ignore them," she advised, bringing Miranda a cup of coffee. "People always love to gossip." "What exactly are they saying?" Miranda asked, dreading the answer. Betty hesitated. "Oh, honey, it's ridiculous stuff. That you blackmailed Mr. Richardson all these years. That you're only working here to get more money from him. That Sarah's scholarship to medical school wasn't earned, but bought with hush money." Miranda felt sick to her stomach. "Sarah earned everything she has. I never took a penny from James, never." "We all know that," Betty assured her. "Anyone who's worked with you knows what kind of person you are, but not everyone knew Miranda like Betty did." By mid-morning, the rumors had reached the medical students doing their rotations, and Sarah couldn't help but notice how people stared at her, how conversations stopped when she entered a room. During rounds, she heard two residents whispering behind her. "That's her, Richardson's secret daughter." "No way, I heard her mother trapped him." Sarah froze. What were they talking about? Richardson, as in James Richardson, the hospital owner? But her father was dead, wasn't he? With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and searched for James Richardson online. There he was in a photo from a charity gala last year, same. Blue eyes as hers, same cleft in the chin, same way of smiling just slightly to the left. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Meanwhile, James was facing his own crisis. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting, and the atmosphere in the conference room was tense. "This is a PR nightmare," one board member declared. "Chen Industries is threatening to pull their investment. Our stock is already dropping." "My personal life has nothing to do with this hospital's operations," James argued. "It does when there are allegations of hush money and cover-ups," another board member countered. "The press is already asking questions. We need to get ahead of this." "I just found out about my daughter," James said through gritted teeth. "I'm not going to let you turn this into a media circus." But it was too late. Victoria had done her work well. As James left the meeting, his assistant handed him the morning's newspapers. The headlines made his blood run cold. Richardson Memorial. Scandal, secret love child revealed. Hospital heir's hidden daughter. What else is he hiding? Questions arise about Richardson Memorial's scholarship program. James crumpled the papers in his fist. Victoria had managed to not only expose his daughter, but also cast doubt on Sarah's academic achievements. He had to do something to protect her, but what? He was still pondering this when Sarah herself burst into his office, tears streaming down her face, clutching her phone with the article about him. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Are you my father?" James stood up slowly, his heart pounding. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Miranda was supposed to have time to explain everything properly. "Sarah, he began, but she cut him off. Answer me. Everyone in the hospital is talking about it. They're saying my mom kept me a secret from you, that she blackmailed you. But that's not true, is it? Because you're supposed to be dead. That's what Mom always told me, that my father died before I was born. Before James could respond, Miranda appeared in the doorway, out of breath. She must have run all the way up when she heard Sarah was here. Sarah, baby, please let me explain, Miranda pleaded. Sarah whirled to face her mother. Explain what? How you lied to me my entire life. How everything I thought I knew about myself is fake. No, sweetheart, not everything. Stop, Sarah shouted. Just stop lying to me. The tension in the room was unbearable. 3 people bound by blood and secrets, finally facing the truth that had been hidden for so long. I think, James said quietly, that we all need to sit down and talk, really talk. But before they could, Victoria sauntered into the office, a newspaper in her hand. Oh, how touching. The family reunion I've been waiting for. Get out, James growled. Now, James, is that any way to treat the woman who finally brought your little family together? Victoria's smile was pure poison. Besides, I thought Sarah might like to know the whole truth about her parents, about how her father chose money and position over love, about how her mother kept her existence a secret out of spite. That's not true, Miranda protested. Isn't it? Victoria raised an elegant eyebrow. Then why didn't you tell her the truth years ago? Why maintain the lie that her father was dead? Sarah looked between all 3 adults, her world crumbling around her. I can't deal with this right now. She turned and ran from the office. Miranda started to follow, but Sarah's voice rang out. Just don't follow me. I need to be alone. As Sarah's footsteps faded down the hallway, the 3 adults stood in painful silence. James finally broke it, turning to Victoria with cold fury in his eyes. Are you happy now? You've ruined everything. Victoria shrugged elegantly. I merely exposed the truth. If it ruins things, perhaps they deserved to be ruined. Miranda, who had been quiet, suddenly stepped forward. For the first time in 15 years, she let all her anger, all her pain show on her face. You think you've won, don't you? You think hurting my daughter makes you powerful? Well, let me tell you something, Victoria. You have no idea what a mother is capable of when someone threatens her child. The threat hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Victoria's perfect composure slipped. Just a little. Outside the hospital, Sarah sat on a bench in the garden, her head in her hands. Her entire life felt like a lie. Her father wasn't dead. He had been right here, walking these same halls. Her mother, whom she trusted more than anyone in the world, had lied to her face for years. And now, because of Victoria's vindictive reveal, her academic achievements were being questioned. Everything she had worked so hard for was tainted by whispers and speculation. She pulled out her phone and looked at her mother's contact photo, the 2 of them smiling at her high school graduation. Was anything in her life real? Was anything what she thought it was? As the sun set over Richardson Memorial Hospital, 4 lives hung in the balance. A daughter questioning everything she knew, a mother desperate to explain her choices, a father trying to make up for lost time, and a woman whose bitterness threatened to destroy them all, but the worst was yet to come. Because Victoria had one more card to play, one that would shake the very foundation of not just the Richardson family, but the entire hospital itself. The next morning, Sarah didn't show up for her hospital rotation. She didn't answer her phone. She wasn't at her apartment. Miranda was sick with worry, calling everyone she could think of who might know where her daughter had gone. She has to be somewhere, Betty tried to comfort her friend. Maybe she just needs time to process everything. But Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her daughter had never disappeared like this before. Never ignored her calls, never shut her out completely. James was equally disturbed. He had his security team searching the city, checking hotels, airports, train stations. The daughter he had just discovered might now be lost to him forever. I found her. The call came from Helen, James's sister, around noon. She's at my house. She looked up my address and came here last night. Said she needed to talk to someone who might know the truth about her father. Miranda and James rushed to Helen's upscale townhouse across the city. They found Sarah sitting in the elegant living room, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes red from crying. Helen stood protectively nearby. "Sarah," Miranda started forward, but Sarah held up a hand to stop her. "Aunt Helen told me everything," Sarah said quietly, "about how Grandfather Richardson threatened to destroy you both if you stayed together, about how he made you choose between love and your future at the hospital." James looked at his sister in surprise. Helen had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who saw all sides of every story. "It's true," Helen confirmed. "Our father was a cruel man, James. What he did to you and Miranda, I should have spoken up back then. Maybe things would have been different." "Why didn't you tell me this?" Sarah asked her mother. "Why make up a story about him being dead?" Miranda sank into a chair, her shoulders heavy with the weight of 15 years of secrets. "Because the truth was too painful. Because I was afraid if you knew your father had chosen money over us, it would hurt you even more than believing he was dead." "I didn't choose money," James interrupted. "I chose survival. Your grandfather threatened to destroy not just my career, but Miranda's too. He said he would make sure she never worked in any hospital in the country." Sarah absorbed this new information, her face a mix of emotions. "So you sacrificed your love to protect each other's careers?" "We were young," Miranda said softly. "We thought we were doing the right thing. And then when I found out I was pregnant..." "I was already married to Victoria," James finished. "The wedding had been rushed through just as father wanted. And, Miranda, I was alone and scared," Miranda admitted. "The man I loved had married another woman. Your grandfather had made it clear he would crush anyone who threatened his plans for the Richardson legacy. So I left. Started over in another city. Had you?" Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. "And now everyone knows. Thanks to Victoria, the whole hospital is talking about me, about us. They're saying I didn't earn my place in medical school, that it was all bought with hush money." "We'll fix this," James said firmly. "I'll hold a press conference, tell everyone the truth." "The truth?" Sarah turned back to face them. "Which truth? That you abandoned Mom? That she lied to me my whole life? That I'm the secret scandal of Richardson Memorial Hospital?" Before anyone could respond, Helen's phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her face went pale. "James, Victoria just called an emergency board meeting. She's making a move to take control of the hospital." "She can't do that," James protested. "She has no authority. She says she has proof that you used hospital funds to pay off Miranda all these years. She's presenting documentation to the board right now." "That's ridiculous," Miranda exclaimed. "I never took a penny from anyone." But Sarah was already pulling out her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "The scholarship program," she said suddenly. "My scholarship to medical school. It came from the Richardson Memorial Foundation, didn't it?" James nodded slowly. "Yes, but you earned that completely on your merit." "The selection committee was headed by you," Sarah finished. "Victoria's going to use that against you, isn't she? Make it look like you knew about me all along and were secretly funneling money to us through the scholarship program." "We have to stop her," Miranda said, standing up. "We have to tell the truth before she twists everything." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was still typing furiously on her laptop, her face intense with concentration. "The Foundation's records, they're all public, aren't they? Every scholarship, every recipient..." Helen moved to look over her shoulder. "Yes, but what are you looking for?" "Patterns," Sarah said grimly. "If Victoria wants to play dirty, let's see what kind of dirt we can find on her. When did she start working with the Foundation?" The next hour was a blur of activity. Sarah, putting her research skills to work, dug through years of Foundation records. Helen made calls to loyal board members. James and Miranda sat together, finally talking honestly about the past they had shared and lost. And then Sarah found something that made her gasp. "Dad," she said, the word feeling strange on her tongue. "You need to see this. Victoria's been embezzling from the Foundation for years. Small amounts, spread across fake scholarship recipients. But it adds up to millions." James looked at the evidence on the screen, his face hardening. "Helen, call security. Have them stop that board meeting." "Now?" But it was too late. Victoria was already standing in front of the hospital board, presenting her carefully crafted lies. She had just reached the dramatic conclusion of her presentation when the doors burst open. James strode in, followed by Miranda, Sarah, and Helen, and Sarah was carrying her laptop. "Before you make any decisions," Sarah announced to the stunned board members, "I think you should see where the Foundation's money has really been going all these years. Victoria's perfect mask cracked." "What is she talking about?" "Funny thing about public records," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "They tell interesting stories if you know how to read them. Like the story of how the ex-wife of the hospital's CEO has been stealing millions through fake scholarship accounts." The boardroom erupted in chaos. Victoria tried to leave, but security was already at the doors. The evidence was clear, damning, and impossible to explain away. As Victoria was led out in handcuffs, she turned to James with hatred in her eyes. "I made you what you are," she spat. "Without me, you'd be nothing." "No," James said quietly, looking at Sarah. "Without you, I might have known my daughter all along. The scandal that followed was not the one Victoria had planned. Instead of destroying the Richardsons, she destroyed herself. The press covered her arrest, the evidence of her embezzlement, and the truth about the scholarship program. And in the midst of it all, a father, mother, and daughter began the slow, careful work of becoming a family. Sarah still had questions, still had anger, still had years of hurt to work through. But as she stood between her parents, watching Victoria being driven away in a police car, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. "So," she said, turning to her parents, "what happens now?" Miranda and James exchanged a look. There was so much to say, so much to explain, so much to heal. But for now, they had their daughter back. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. The weeks following Victoria's arrest were a whirlwind of changes at Richardson Memorial Hospital. The press camped outside for days, hoping to catch glimpses of the newly discovered Richardson heir. Reporters called constantly, wanting interviews about the scandal and the family reunion. But inside the hospital walls, 3 people were trying to figure out how to be a family after 15 years apart. Sarah had moved back to her apartment, needing space to process everything. She still came to the hospital for her rotations, but everything felt different now. People didn't whisper about scandals anymore. Instead, they called her a hero for exposing Victoria's crimes. But that didn't make things easier with her parents. "Dr. Williams wants me to assist in surgery today," Sarah told her mother one morning in the cafeteria. They were having breakfast together, trying to maintain some normalcy. Miranda smiled, but it was strained. Things were still awkward between them. "That's wonderful, honey. You've earned it." "Yeah." Sarah pushed her food around on her plate. "Mom, do you think we could talk about what happened? I mean, really talk?" Before Miranda could answer, James appeared at their table. He had been trying to give Sarah space, but he couldn't. Stay away completely. "Good morning," he said carefully. "May I join you?" Sarah nodded and James sat down. The 3 of them, together in public for the first time since the scandal broke, drew curious looks from other hospital staff. "I've been thinking," James said, "about making some changes to the hospital's scholarship program. Sarah, I'd like your input, since you understand both sides of it now." Sarah put down her fork. "Both sides?" "Being a recipient and being a Richardson," James explained. "Your perspective could help us make the program stronger, more transparent." "I'm not sure I'm ready to be a Richardson," Sarah said quietly. "I've been Sarah Foster my whole life." The hurt on James's face was visible, but he tried to hide it. "Of course. I understand. I just thought—" "I'm not saying never," Sarah interrupted. "I'm just saying that I need time. We all need time." Miranda reached for her daughter's hand. "Sweetie, whatever you decide about your name, about your relationship with James, about anything, it's your choice. We've made enough choices for you." James nodded in agreement, but before he could speak, Betty rushed up to their table. "Miranda, Sarah, you need to see this." She thrust a tablet at them. On the screen was a breaking news story. Victoria Richardson escapes police custody. The color drained from James's face. "That's impossible. The security—" "She had help," Betty explained, scrolling through the article. "Someone on the inside. They're saying she cleaned out offshore accounts before she was arrested. She has money, connections, and a grudge against all of us," Miranda finished, her voice shaking. Security at the hospital was immediately increased. James insisted on hiring private protection for both Miranda and Sarah, despite their protests. But Victoria seemed to have vanished completely. Days passed, then weeks. The media frenzy about Victoria's escape gradually died down. Life at Richardson Memorial started to find a new normal. Sarah continued her medical training, sometimes working directly with James on hospital policy changes. Miranda watched her daughter and her former love slowly building a cautious relationship, trying to ignore the ache in her own heart. One evening, Sarah was working late in the hospital library, researching for a complicated case. The building was quiet, most of the staff gone for the day. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. "Hello, Sarah, dear." Sarah spun around to find Victoria standing there, looking quite different from her usual polished self. Her designer clothes had been replaced by simple dark clothing, her perfect makeup gone, her hair pulled back severely. "How did you get in?" "Here?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady as she reached for her phone. "Don't bother calling for help," Victoria said smoothly. "I've taken care of the security cameras and the guards on this floor. We need to have a little chat, you and I, about family." Sarah stood up slowly, keeping the table between them. "There's nothing to talk about. You tried to destroy my family." Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your family? Oh, you naive girl. Do you really think James wants to play daddy now? Do you think he can make up for 15 years of absence? Do you think your mother's lies were really to protect you?" "You don't know anything about my mother," Sarah said firmly. "I know she was a scheming little nurse who thought she could trap James Richardson with a pregnancy." Victoria spat. "I know she's been playing the victim all these years while secretly taking money from the hospital foundation." "That's a lie. The investigation proved what I wanted them to find." Victoria moved closer, her eyes wild. "You think you're so clever, finding those fake scholarship accounts. Did you ever wonder why they were so easy to find? Why the trail led so perfectly to me?" Sarah felt her blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother's been embezzling from this hospital for years," Victoria said with a cruel smile. "I just took the fall because James was too blind to see the truth. But now..." She pulled out a USB drive. "Now I have proof, real proof, and once I release it, your perfect little family reunion will be over." Sarah's mind raced. She didn't believe Victoria, couldn't believe her. But why was she here? What was her real plan? "You're lying," Sarah said, edging toward the door. "The police proved you were behind everything." "The police found what I let them find," Victoria replied. "Your mother's quite clever, I'll give her that. She set up accounts through shell companies, routed money through overseas banks, but I found it all, and now..." She never finished her sentence, because at that moment the library doors burst open. James, Miranda, and several security guards rushed in. "Drop it, Victoria," James commanded. "We heard everything." Victoria's face contorted with rage. "How?" Sarah held up her phone. "I pressed the emergency alert as soon as I saw you. Did you really think I wouldn't have protection after you escaped?" Victoria lunged for Sarah, but the security guards were faster. As they handcuffed her, she screamed accusations and threats, her composure finally completely shattered. After she was taken away, Sarah collapsed into her mother's arms, shaking. "Mom, what she said about you was all lies," James interrupted firmly. "We've been investigating since she escaped. She was trying to frame Miranda just like she tried to frame me. She thought if she could turn us against each other, she could destroy us all." Miranda held her daughter tight. "I never took anything from this hospital except my salary and my pride in watching you follow your dreams." Sarah looked between her parents, seeing the truth in their eyes. "I know," she said softly. "I know who you are, Mom. Both of you," she added, including James in her gaze. Later that night, as things calmed down, the three of them sat in James's office, emotionally exhausted, but somehow closer than before. "I've been thinking," Sarah said slowly, "about names and family and everything else." Her parents waited, hardly daring to breathe. I want to keep Foster as my middle name, she continued. But maybe I could be Sarah Foster Richardson. For both of you. The smile that broke across James's face was like the sun coming out. Miranda's eyes filled with tears. Are you sure? James asked. Sarah nodded. Victoria tried to tear us apart by digging up the past. But maybe it's time we all stopped letting the past control us. Maybe it's time to build something new. Outside the office window, the lights of Richardson Memorial Hospital glowed steadily in the night. Inside, a family that had been broken by lies was slowly being rebuilt with truth. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was real. And sometimes that's all a family needs to begin healing. With Victoria back in custody and facing serious charges, life at Richardson Memorial Hospital should have settled down. But just as one storm passed, another was brewing on the horizon. This one came in the form of Robert Richardson, James's father, who had been living in Europe for the past decade. The morning he walked into the hospital, heads turned. Even at 75, Robert Richardson commanded attention. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccable, and his face wore the same stern expression that had terrorized hospital staff for 30 years. "Where is my son?" he demanded at the reception desk. "And my granddaughter?" James was in a board meeting when his secretary interrupted with the news. His face went pale. "My father is here?" Miranda, who was changing shifts at the nurses' station, saw Robert first. She froze, remembering the last time she had seen him, the day he had threatened to destroy her career if she didn't leave James alone. "Well, well," Robert's voice was cold as ice. "The nurse who wasn't good enough for my son. Tell me, did you plan it all along, getting pregnant to trap him?" Before Miranda could respond, Sarah appeared around the corner. She had been heading to check on a patient when she heard the commotion. Robert's eyes widened as he saw her. The resemblance to his late wife was startling. "Grandfather," Sarah said quietly, standing tall. She had heard enough stories about this man to be on her guard. Robert's expression softened slightly. "You look just like my Elizabeth," he said, referring to his deceased wife. "But that nurse's blood runs in your veins too, doesn't it?" "That nurse is my mother," Sarah replied firmly, "and she's the reason I'm becoming a doctor." James arrived then, putting himself between his father and his family. "What are you doing here, father? Can't a man visit his own hospital?" Robert smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Especially when he hears that his son has been making quite a mess of things. Victoria in jail, scandal in the papers, a secret granddaughter suddenly appearing. "This is my hospital now," James said. "You retired years ago." "Ah, but I still hold quite a bit of stock, don't I?" Robert's smile grew colder. "And I've been talking to some of our major investors. They're concerned about the recent instability in leadership." James felt his stomach drop. His father had always been a master at corporate manipulation. "What do you want?" "Just what's best for the hospital," Robert said smoothly. "And right now that might mean new leadership. Someone without all this family drama." Miranda stepped forward. "You haven't changed at all, have you? Still trying to control everyone's lives?" "I protected this hospital," Robert snapped. "I built it into what it is today. I wasn't about to let my son throw it all away for a gold-digging nurse." "Mom wasn't gold-digging," Sarah interrupted. "She worked her way through nursing school. She raised me alone. She never took a penny from anyone." Robert turned to his granddaughter. "You seem intelligent enough. Perhaps we could make a deal. Come work directly for me. I'll create a position for you in hospital administration. Better than wasting your time with medical training." "No deal," Sarah said immediately. "I'm going to be a doctor. That's not negotiable." Robert's face hardened. "Just like your father. Too stubborn to see what's best for you." "What's best for me?" Sarah laughed incredulously. "You destroyed my parents' happiness. You kept me from knowing my father for 15 years, and now you want to control my future too?" "I did what had to be done," Robert insisted. "This hospital is a legacy. It needs to be run by people who understand that, not by people who let their emotions cloud their judgment." Just then, Betty rushed up to them. "Dr. Richardson, Sarah, we need you both in emergency. Multiple trauma coming in from a building. Collapse." James looked at his father. "We'll finish this discussion later. Right now we have patients who need us." Robert watched as his son and granddaughter rushed toward the emergency department, working in perfect sync. Miranda followed, them already preparing for the incoming trauma cases. Over the next few hours, the emergency department was chaos. James coordinated with the trauma teams, Sarah assisted where she could, and Miranda moved efficiently between patients. They worked together like a well-oiled machine, saving lives. Robert observed it all from the sidelines. He saw how the staff respected his son, not out of fear as they had respected him, but out of genuine admiration. He saw how Sarah handled pressure with grace and skill, and he saw how Miranda's experience and compassion made her invaluable to the hospital. When the crisis was over, Robert found James in his office. "You've done well here," Robert admitted grudgingly. "Different from how I would have done things, but, well, I learned from your mistakes, Father," James said quietly. "You taught me how to run a hospital, but Miranda and Sarah taught me what a hospital should be, a place of healing, not just a business." Robert was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother would have liked her," he finally said. "Sarah, she has Elizabeth's spirit. She has Miranda's spirit too," James pointed out. "And that's equally valuable." Robert walked to the window, looking out at the hospital grounds. "I may have been hasty in my judgment 15 years ago. It was as close to an apology as they were likely to get." James knew his father well enough to recognize the olive branch being extended. "Sarah needs her grandfather," James said carefully, "but not one who tries to control her life. She needs someone who will support her choices, even if they're different from what you would choose." Robert turned back to his son. "And what about you? What do you need?" "I need you to accept that Miranda is part of this family now, not just as Sarah's mother, but as someone I never stopped loving." The words hung in the air between them. Robert looked at his son, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time in years. "Love," he said, as if testing the word. "Your mother used to tell me I'd forgotten what that meant, that I cared more about the hospital than about our family. Was she right?" Robert's shoulders sagged slightly. "Perhaps, but it's not too late to learn from my mistakes, is it?" Outside the office, Sarah and Miranda were waiting anxiously. They had seen Robert enter and feared another confrontation. But when the door opened, both James and his father were smiling. "Sarah," Robert said, his voice gentler than before, "would you and your mother join me for dinner tonight? I believe I have 15 years of grandfather stories to catch up on." Sarah looked at her mother, who nodded slightly. "We'd like that," Sarah said. "But I have one condition." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Oh? No more talk about changing my career path. I'm going to be a doctor, and that's final." To everyone's surprise, Robert laughed. "You really are just like your grandmother. She never let me tell her what to do either." As they walked together toward the hospital exit, Robert turned to Miranda. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Several, in fact. Miranda looked at this man who had caused her so much pain, who was now trying in his own way to make amends. "The past is the past," she said. "What matters is what we do now." The sun was setting over Richardson Memorial Hospital, casting long shadows across the grounds. Inside its walls, lives had been saved today. And perhaps, in a different way, a family had been saved too. The dinner with Robert Richardson marked a turning point for the family, but new challenges were just around the corner. As Christmas approached, the hospital was decorated with festive lights and garlands. It would be the first holiday season the Richardsons would spend together as a family, but the path to celebration wasn't going to be smooth. The trouble started when Helen, James's sister, arrived from London with unexpected news. She found James in his office reviewing end-of-year reports. "James, we need to talk," Helen said, closing the door behind her. "It's about Victoria." James looked up sharply. "What about her? She's in maximum security this time. There's no way she can escape again." "It's not about escape," Helen said, sinking into a chair. "She's dying, James. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prison doctor gives her weeks, maybe days." James sat back, stunned. Victoria, the woman who had tried to destroy his family, was facing her own mortality. "Does anyone else know?" "That's why I'm here," Helen replied. She's asking to see Sarah. She says she has something important to tell her before she dies. Absolutely not, James said immediately. After everything she's done? But word traveled fast in the hospital. By lunchtime, Sarah had heard about Victoria's condition from one of the oncology nurses. She found her father in the hospital cafeteria, where he was having lunch with Miranda. "Why didn't you tell me about Victoria?" Sarah demanded, sitting down at their table. Miranda reached for her daughter's hand. "We only just found out, honey." "She wants to see me," Sarah said. "I think I should go." "No," both her parents said simultaneously. Sarah looked between them. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm 25 years old. I can make my own decisions." "Sarah." "Honey?" Miranda tried to reason with her. "Victoria is manipulative. Even now she's probably trying to cause trouble." "Or maybe she's truly sorry," Sarah argued. "Maybe facing death has changed her. Don't we believe in second chances in this hospital?" James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah had learned she'd inherited from him. "It's not that simple." "Actually, it is," Sarah stood up. "I'm going to see her today. Either you can support my decision or you can't, but you can't stop me." Robert, who had been quietly observing from a nearby table, approached them. "She's right, you know. She's old enough to make her own choices." He turned to Sarah. "But you're not going alone. I'll go with you." Everyone stared at him in surprise. Robert shrugged. "I've known Victoria longer than any of you. I know all her tricks. If she tries anything, I'll know." That afternoon, Sarah and Robert drove to the prison hospital. Victoria lay in a hospital bed, looking nothing like the elegant, powerful woman she'd once been. Her face was gaunt, her designer clothes replaced by a hospital gown, her perfectly styled hair now thin and brittle. "Sarah?" Victoria's voice was weak, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "And Robert, how unexpected." "You wanted to see me," Sarah said, staying near the door. "I'm here." Victoria tried to sit up straighter. "You're so much like your grandmother. Elizabeth would have been proud of you." She looked at Robert. "Wouldn't she have?" Robert nodded stiffly. "Yes, she would. I never had children," Victoria continued. "Never wanted them. But watching you, Sarah, seeing how you handled everything I threw at you, I realized what I'd missed." "Is that why you asked me here?" Sarah asked. "To tell me you regret not having children?" "No," Victoria's face hardened slightly. "I asked you here because I need to warn you. The documentation I threatened you with, about your mother, it wasn't all fake." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "There were irregularities in the hospital's finances during those years," Victoria said. "But it wasn't your mother who was responsible. It was Elizabeth Richardson." Robert stepped forward. "What are you talking about?" "Your wife, Robert." Victoria's voice was getting weaker. She knew about Sarah from the beginning. She was secretly sending money to Miranda, helping her with Sarah's expenses. She set up accounts that looked like scholarship funds, but they were really her way of supporting her granddaughter. Robert sank into a chair, his face pale. "Elizabeth knew all those years?" "She never told you because she knew you'd stop it," Victoria continued. "She made me promise to keep the accounts going after she died. That's how I discovered them. But instead of honoring her wishes, I used the information to try to destroy the family she wanted to protect." Sarah's mind was spinning. "My grandmother knew about me. She tried to help us." "She visited you once," Victoria said, "when you were about 5. She watched you playing in a park with your mother. She said you looked just like James when he was little." Robert's hands were shaking. "Why? Are you telling us this now?" "Because Elizabeth was my friend." Victoria's voice was barely a whisper now. "And in the end, I betrayed not just James and Sarah, but her memory too. I wanted you to know, to understand." Her voice trailed off as a coughing fit overtook her. The prison doctor rushed in, and Sarah and Robert were asked to leave. The car ride back to the hospital. Both were lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Do you think she was telling the truth about grandmother?" Robert nodded slowly. "Elizabeth always had her own way of doing things, and she used to talk about Miranda sometimes, about how wrong I'd been, to separate them. I thought she was just being sentimental, but now When they returned to Richardson Memorial, they found James and Miranda waiting anxiously in James's office. Helen was there too, pacing nervously. "What happened?" James demanded. As soon as they walked in, "What did she want?" Sarah looked at her grandfather, who nodded encouragingly. "She told us about Grandmother Elizabeth," she said quietly, "about how she knew about me all along, how she tried to help Mom in secret." Miranda's hand flew to her mouth. "The anonymous deposits, to help with Sarah's school fees, and that was Elizabeth?" "My wife," Robert's voice cracked slightly, "always doing what she thought was right, no matter what I said." He turned to Miranda. "She saw what I couldn't. She tried to fix my mistakes." James sat down heavily in his chair. "Mother knew I had a daughter all that time. She wanted to tell you," Robert said. "She fought with me about it constantly, but I threatened to cut off the money she was sending to them if she did." He looked at Miranda. "I owe you another apology, and I owe my wife's memory one too." Helen wiped tears from her eyes. "Mother always said the hospital should be about healing people, not just making money. I guess she was healing our family too, in her own way." Victoria passed away that night. Her last act had been to reveal a truth that would help heal the wounds she had helped create. The revelation about Elizabeth Richardson changed everything, especially for Robert. The knowledge that his wife had secretly supported the granddaughter he had rejected seemed to break something open in him. As Christmas approached, Robert threw himself into planning the perfect family holiday. He opened up the old Richardson mansion, which had been closed since Elizabeth's death. He insisted on having a huge Christmas tree in the entrance hall, just like Elizabeth used to demand. "Your grandmother loved Christmas," he told Sarah as they decorated the tree together. "She would have loved having you here." Sarah picked up an old ornament, a delicate glass angel. "Did she really come to watch me in the park when I was little?" Knowing Elizabeth, she probably came more than once. Robert smiled sadly. "She always said love was more important than pride. I should have listened to her." On Christmas Eve, the whole family gathered at the mansion. Miranda felt strange being in the house where she had once been told she wasn't good enough for the Richardsons. But now, watching Sarah hang ornaments with her grandfather, seeing James smile at them both, she felt Elizabeth's presence somehow, approving, supporting, loving. "She would have loved this," Helen said, coming to stand beside Miranda. "All of us together. It's what she always wanted." As snow fell softly outside the windows of the Richardson mansion, inside, a family celebrated not just Christmas, but the healing power of truth and love. Victoria's last confession had given them all an unexpected gift, the knowledge that even in the darkest times, love had been working quietly, patiently, to bring them back together. The new year brought fresh challenges and opportunities to Richardson Memorial Hospital. Sarah was excelling in her medical training, now working closely with some of the hospital's top surgeons. James and Miranda were slowly finding their way back to each other, though neither wanted to rush things. And Robert, changed by the revelations about Elizabeth, was becoming the grandfather Sarah had never known she needed. But peace never lasted long in their world. The morning everything changed again started like any other. Sarah was making her rounds when she encountered a new patient in the cardiac ward. Margaret Chen, the mother of David Chen, whose investment firm had almost pulled out of the hospital. During Victoria's schemes, "Dr. Richardson," Margaret called out as Sarah checked her chart. "I've been hoping to meet you." Sarah looked up, surprised. The elderly woman was smiling at her kindly. "Mrs. Chen, how are you feeling today?" "Oh, my heart's giving me trouble again." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to tell you about your grandmother." Sarah sat down slowly in the chair beside the bed. "You knew my grandmother, Elizabeth?" "We were best friends in college," Margaret smiled. "She was my maid of honor when I married David's father. And she was also the one who told me to watch over you and your mother." "What?" Sarah leaned forward. "You knew about me too?" Margaret nodded. "Elizabeth made me promise to keep an eye on you both. Why do you think my son's firm never completely pulled out of the hospital, even when Victoria was causing all that trouble? Elizabeth made us promise to protect her family no matter what." Sarah's mind was racing. "But I never saw you before." "No, but I saw you." at your high school graduation, your college acceptance ceremony. Elizabeth couldn't be there, but she wanted someone to witness your achievements. I sent her pictures, told her how well you were doing. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. She really cared that much? Oh, my dear. Margaret reached for her hand. She loved you so much. She kept every article about your academic achievements, every picture I sent her. She had a whole box of memories of the granddaughter she couldn't publicly claim. Sarah wiped her eyes. Do you know what happened to the box? That's why I wanted to talk to you, Margaret said. I know where it is. Elizabeth gave it to me for safekeeping before she died. She made me promise to give it to you when the time was right. Just then, James walked into the room. Mrs. Chen, I didn't know you were admitted. James, Margaret smiled warmly. You look so much like your mother when you smile. I was just telling Sarah about Elizabeth's memory box. James looked between them, confused. Memory box? Your mother kept a box of memories about Sarah, Margaret explained. Pictures, articles, little notes about her achievements. She wanted Sarah to have it someday, to know how much she was loved. James sank into a chair, overwhelmed. All this time, Mother knew everything. She was watching over them. She was trying to protect everyone, Margaret said gently. She knew Robert would eventually come around, that you would find your way back to Miranda. She just had to keep the family connected somehow until that happened. Later that day, Margaret's son David arrived at the hospital with a large wooden box. The whole family gathered in James's office as Sarah opened it with trembling hands. Inside were hundreds of photographs, Sarah's first day of school, her science fair victories, her graduation. There were newspaper clippings about her academic achievements, programs from school plays she'd performed in, even a copy of her college application essay. But most precious were Elizabeth's notes. Short observations written in elegant handwriting. Sarah won first place in the science fair today, just like her father at that age. She has Miranda's kind heart. Watched her help an elderly man cross the street. She wants to be a doctor. James would be so proud. Robert picked up a photo of Sarah at age 5 playing in the park, the day Victoria had mentioned. Elizabeth had written on the back, "Watched my granddaughter today. She has James's smile and Miranda's grace." Robert is wrong to keep them apart. Love finds a way. She never gave up on us, James said softly, reading over his father's shoulder. Even when we all gave up on each other. Miranda was looking through some of the older photos. I remember, to this day, she said, holding up a picture of Sarah's 10th birthday. Someone sent an anonymous gift, a children's doctor kit. That was you, wasn't it, Mrs. Chen? Margaret nodded. Elizabeth picked it out. She knew Sarah was interested in medicine even then. Sarah found a sealed envelope at the bottom of the box, addressed to her in her grandmother's handwriting. With shaking hands, she opened it. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally come out. I want you to know that you were loved, watched over, and celebrated from the very beginning. Your grandfather's pride and your father's absence were never a reflection on you. They were the mistakes of men who forgot that love is more important than anything else. I've watched you grow into an amazing young woman. I've seen your mother's strength in you, your father's determination, and perhaps a little of my own stubbornness too. I'm sorry I couldn't be there openly, but I was always there in the shadows, cheering for every achievement, proud of every success. The hospital you're training in now was built on the idea of healing, not just bodies but spirits too. I hope that by the time you read this, our family will have found its own healing. Remember that love doesn't always show itself in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, the secret support, the patient waiting for hearts to change. You are a Richardson and a Foster, the best of both. Families, never let anyone make you feel otherwise. All my love, Grandmother Elizabeth. There wasn't a dry eye in the office when Sarah finished reading. Robert had turned to the window, his shoulders shaking slightly. James had his arm around Miranda, who was crying openly. Even David Chen was wiping his eyes. We have to do something, Sarah said suddenly. Something to honor her memory. What do you mean? James asked. Grandmother believed in healing families, not just patients. What if we created a new program? At the hospital? The Elizabeth Richardson Family Support Center, a place where families of long-term patients can get help, counseling, support. Robert turned back from the window. Elizabeth would have loved that, he said hoarsely. She always said we needed to treat the whole family, not just the patient. We can use part of the old East Wing, James added, warming to the idea. Set up comfortable waiting areas, counseling rooms, maybe even some temporary housing for families who come from far away. And we can start a scholarship program, Sarah continued excitedly. Not just for medical students, but for families who need help caring for sick relatives. We can call it the Elizabeth Richardson Legacy Fund. Margaret Chen smiled from her hospital bed. I think I know where you can get your first donation. David? Her son nodded. Chen Industries would be honored to help establish the center for Elizabeth. As they all discussed plans for the new center, Sarah held her grandmother's letter close. Somewhere she felt sure Elizabeth was watching, happy to see her family finally whole, finally healing. But even as they made plans to honor Elizabeth's memory, none of them could have predicted the challenge that was about to test their newly rebuilt family bonds. Because sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't the initial wound, it's trusting that the healing will last. 6 months after discovering Elizabeth's memory box, Richardson Memorial Hospital was buzzing with excitement. The Elizabeth Richardson Family Support Center was ready to open, and the whole family had gathered for the ceremony. The old East Wing had been transformed into a warm, welcoming space where families could find comfort during difficult times. Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her office, adjusting her white coat. The name on her badge now read, Dr. Sarah Foster Richardson, a tribute to both sides of her family. But today, she wasn't just a doctor. She was also the center's director, chosen unanimously by the board. Ready for your speech? James asked, appearing in her doorway. As ready as I'll ever be, Sarah smiled nervously. Is everyone here? The whole family, James confirmed. Even Aunt Helen flew in from London, and the press is here too. They're calling it the biggest change in hospital policy since your grandfather's time. Sarah followed her father through the corridors she'd grown to love. These halls had seen so much of their family's story, pain and healing, secrets and truths, separations and reunions. The new center's lobby was packed with people. Miranda was there in her nurse's uniform, proud tears in her eyes. Robert stood, tall beside her, looking more relaxed than anyone could remember seeing him. Betty was there too, along with Margaret Chen in a wheelchair, now fully recovered from her heart problems. As Sarah approached the podium, she saw photos of her grandmother Elizabeth displayed prominently on the wall behind her. The largest one showed Elizabeth in her younger days, standing in front of the hospital with a determined smile, the same smile Sarah now wore. Welcome, everyone, Sarah began, her voice steady. Today we're not just opening a new center. We're honoring a woman who understood that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about family, support, and love. She looked at her parents standing, side by side. My grandmother Elizabeth knew something that took the rest of us years to learn, that sometimes the people who need the most healing aren't the patients, but the families who love them. Robert stepped forward then, surprising everyone by taking the microphone. My wife Elizabeth was wiser than I ever gave her credit for, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She knew that this hospital needed to be more than just a business. It needed to be a place of healing, for bodies, minds, and families. James joined them at the podium. That's why today we're not just opening the Elizabeth Richardson Family Support Center. We're also announcing the Elizabeth Richardson Legacy Fund, which will provide assistance to families struggling with long-term medical care. Miranda came forward too, holding a large envelope. And our first recipients are already chosen, she announced. 20 families who need help caring for their loved ones. Elizabeth would have wanted that. Immediate action, not just promises. As the ceremony continued, Sarah looked out at the crowd. There were her fellow doctors, the nurses she'd worked with, the staff who'd become like family. There were patients and their families, all hoping for the healing this new center promised. But most importantly, there was her family, her mother who had raised her with strength and love, her father who was making up for lost time with dedication and care, her grandfather who had learned that it's never too late to change, and watching over them all, her grandmother's spirit, finally recognized and honored. Later that evening, the family gathered in James's office for a private celebration. Robert raised a glass in toast. "To Elizabeth," he said softly, "who never gave up on any of us. And to family," Sarah added, "both the ones we're born with and the ones we build." Miranda and James exchanged a look, and James cleared his throat. "Speaking of family," he said, taking Miranda's hand, "we have an announcement to make." Everyone turned to look at them. Miranda was glowing with happiness. "We're getting married," she said, again, this time with no secrets, no fears, and our whole family there to celebrate. Sarah rushed to hug her parents. "Finally!" she exclaimed. "I was wondering how long it would take you two to figure it out." Robert laughed, a real joyful laugh that made him sound years younger. "Elizabeth would have loved this. She always said you two would find your way back to each other." "The wedding will be here," James announced. "In the hospital garden next to the new center. It seems fitting, doesn't it?" "This place has seen our worst moments and our best ones." As they celebrated, Betty poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Richardson, both of you, you're needed in emergency. Major trauma coming in." Sarah and James exchanged a look, then moved into action simultaneously. This was who they were now, father and daughter, doctors, healers. "Go," Miranda said, understanding in her eyes. "Save lives. We'll plan the wedding while you're busy." As Sarah and James hurried toward the emergency department, Sarah caught a glimpse of her grandmother's photo on the wall. The same determined smile, the same sense of purpose. Elizabeth had known all along that love would find a way, that family would triumph over pride, that healing would come in its own time. Richardson Memorial Hospital stood strong against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with warmth and hope. Inside its walls, patients were being healed, families were being supported, and love was winning over pain. Just as Elizabeth had always wanted, and in the garden where James and Miranda would soon be remarried, where the new family support center opened its doors to those in need, where a young doctor named Sarah Foster Richardson was building her own legacy, the spirit of Elizabeth Richardson lived on, in the kindness shown to strangers, in the healing of broken hearts, and in the triumph of love over all the obstacles life could create. The end. Epilogue. 1 year later, the Elizabeth Richardson Family Support Center had helped hundreds of families. Sarah had completed her residency and was now a full-fledged surgeon, following in her father's footsteps while blazing her own trail. James and Miranda's second wedding was everything their first one should have been, filled with love, family, and truth. Robert had retired properly this time, focusing on being the grandfather he should have been all along. He spent his days telling Sarah stories about Elizabeth, sharing memories of the grandmother who had loved her from afar. And in the hospital halls, people still talked about the Richardson family, not about scandals or secrets anymore, but about healing, hope, and the power of love to bridge any distance and heal any wound. The photo of Elizabeth still hung in the center's lobby, her smile welcoming every family who came, seeking help. Below it, a plaque bore her favorite saying, "Love heals all wounds. Sometimes it just needs time and patience." Sarah often stood before that photo, touching her grandmother's face gently. "Thank you," she would whisper, "for never giving up on us, for showing us the way home." And somewhere Elizabeth Richardson was smiling, knowing that her family had finally found the healing she had always prayed for.